everybody who's out there participating in this part of the symposium, and thank you very much for your attention and your participation today. I'm very pleased to moderate the continuation of today's symposium with a panel of distinguished discussants who are going to offer their personal, professional insights and, importantly, critical analysis on Budget 21, as well as, I hope, their perspectives on Dave's presentation that we've all just listened to and are already thinking about, I'm sure. And the point is to continue the dialogue, as Dave noted at the end of his comments. We have a total of 30 minutes for this session. So I will be keeping the introduction short and hopefully the conversation moving, and keeping an eye on the Q's and A's, which I think is open soon or already for everybody. And please note that the full bios of our discussants are available in the conference materials. I'm going to provide a short intro to each of them and then get the discussion going. So in the order that our panelists will be speaking, first, Robert Aslan, Senior VP, Policy, Business Council of Canada. Robert leads the Business Council's work on economic recovery and development of policies regarding economic growth and job creation. Irene Sterian, Founder, President, and CEO of the REMAP, that's the Refined Manufacturing Acceleration Process Network, a technology accelerator. And Irene is a strategic technology leader with a focus on the electronics manufacturing sector and is a driving force in the future of manufacturing in Canada. And David Wolf, Professor of Political Science, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab, Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And in the interest of time, Dave's title says it all. So everyone, please make use of the Q&A feature to put your questions up to discussions. I'll be reaching to these questions to engage the discussions following their comments. So with that introduction, Robert, I invite your comments.
Thank you, Janet. And I'm grateful for the invitation and I have a chance to be a participant in this discussion. Maybe a few general thoughts, and I look forward to my colleagues' comments. First of all, I should say I overall agree very much with David's presentation, both on the diagnostic of our problem, but also extensively on what needs to be addressed. I do have a few differences of opinion on processes, but I don't think that matters. Overall, I thought it was a very comprehensive and excellent presentation. So a few thoughts I think we need to ask ourselves and challenge ourselves with at this particular moment. The first is the overall question, I think, is the right one, and that was asked in David's presentation. Essentially, where will economic growth come from in the long run? I think our economy is recovering fast from this COVID crisis that is not over, obviously, but the contraction that we had last year was about 5.1% of GDP. This year, most forecasts think that both for the private sector, the Bank of Canada, most economists does indicate that we will be over 6%, 6.5%, maybe even in 2021. That shows that in the short term, a stimulus wasn't necessarily necessary. And I think that was a miss in the budget in the sense that it was very much framed as a short-term stimulus, which I think was the wrong policy answer to a problem that is more structural, that is long-term. So on the innovation question specifically, I very much agree with the lack of strategic focus. I was very disappointed by overall the lack of vision in this budget on the long term. Some individual measures that make sense to me, but overall no strategic coherent framework for growth. And why innovation is so important, it's worth reminding ourselves, is that we're a fast-aging society. We have a fundamental productivity problem that makes more honest, more importance, that puts more importance and onus on innovation, because that's the only way we'll be able to increase productivity in a significant way going forward. And that is why the focus on science technology for me is so key. Um, when we think about what it's in the budget, the biggest investment, I think David, as Isla did this, is basically doing more what we did previously. Strategic Innovation Fund being probably on top of mind. When you study industrial policy, industrial strategy, one doesn't have to go far to realize that giving money to firms directly is probably not the most astute way to do this, to accomplish and do industrial policy smartly. The missing part I find in Canada overall, but in this budget, I think was very obvious, is this lack of intentionality on building sectoral capabilities. Where do we want to place some bets for the future? I think was lacking. There were some, tentative investments in quantum, and those are probably good in AI, but very in the margin, very much in the margin, not present in a more comprehensive growth strategy. The Business Council has advocated the DARPA model, going back to David comment on the lack of applied research and this bridge that we haven't been able to build in Canada between ideas, intellectual capital, and firms, and this necessity of scaling and commercializing at scale our ideas. Um, I think that this part is missing, is still not there. And I'm struggling to find in this budget any tentative answer to this problem. Um, David spoke to the execution implementation problem. I really much agree. 270 measures, ministers lining up at Treasury boards for many months, LP chaos. I did two budgets myself. I should have said that at the beginning. In the finance minister's office, I was the budget director in 2016, 17. In best of times, governments move very slowly. I cannot see a steadfast implementation, execution of this budget. And more importantly, there's no prioritization of what needs to go, before, there's no prioritization of measures in this budget, which I think is problematic. I'll just close in saying two important things. The first is the world is moving fast, and competitiveness was astute before the pandemic. Now it's just even more important and even more prescient as an issue. And I would just point down to the audience what's happening in the United States right now. Just in the last 2 weeks, in my view, two very important milestones. The first is this bipartisan effort coming out of Congress on the Endless Frontier Act. Some of you will remember the Endless Frontier coming out of World War II, from Vannevar Bush vision of basic research investments, and the FDR and Truman push that really made a huge difference in US innovation policy, and I would argue in competitiveness and growth going forward. Um, and so this bipartisan bill really focusing on sectors where US is doubling down, this vision and this very conscientious uh, idea that China is a competitor and that industrial policy is now necessary. So that was a very meaningful, I think, event. I think this is something we need to keep watching because it speaks about the urgency of the moment. Secondly, the White House Council of Economic Advisors just released a few days ago a white paper that I thought was fascinating on a national energy innovation strategy. It's really a must-read document because it speaks comprehensively about how innovation policy should be thought about and should be implemented. And it also shows want to be too critical about Canada. I think we have a lot of things going for us, but on the execution side, we're not always very intentional. It just shows how big we fail to understand the need in Canada, in my view, to act on all stages of innovation process, not just on basic science, as important as it is, and as a fan as I am of basic research, but moving from R&D to demonstration to support for initial commercialization and then scaling our firm. And I'm hoping David will speak more on the scaling side of things. But this is the productivity issue we have in front of us. Scaling from SMEs to large firms, allowing more business investments, uh, and being able to, having our firm be more competitive on the global stage in the supply chains that are being rebuilt right now. This is the
Robert,
size of the scope that we have to face. So just on that, I'll back to you, Janet.
thank you very much, and thank you for your points. And we can move to Irene.
Great. Thank you very much, Janet. I also agree very much with Dave's analysis and his 5 arguments. And I'm an optimist and I'm a manufacturing engineer. So I like to address his 5 arguments with that lens. So first of all, the long-term economic growth. I think it's really important for SME digital transformation to happen, but especially in product design, manufacture, and supply chain in Canada. So not just manufacturing for other companies, but designing our own products. And I think we need to think big in terms of hardware, software, and AI together for manufacturing. And if anything has shown us, COVID-19 has shown us that companies that are digital were already faster to pivot and adapt. The second thing that Dave mentioned, his argument was about investing efficiently in R&D and innovation. And I think technology adoption is very important. I think as Robert mentioned, but as well as technology adoption, we need a metric to measure the success. So we've been using the TRL scale or technology readiness level or MRL scale, manufacturing readiness level. Those are scales developed by NASA and DoD in the 70s and 80s. They're not digital scales. And we're still using that now. And I think we need to look at how to develop a new digital transformation scale to be able to measure our progress. The third thing is looking at building collaborations. And I think the Strategic Innovation Fund can do that. They've addressed automotive, aerospace, and life sciences, but it's only Stream 5, which is the not-for-profit networks that can actually build private partnerships with the private sector. So it's not just giving companies funding one at a time. We need companies to collaborate with each other and provide collective industry support, not just individual company support. The fourth argument that he had was about the opportunity to coordinate services and cross sectors with one mission. And I think one opportunity here is a green economy or the zero emission technology manufacturing that was mentioned in the budget. I think of it though as like a 3-legged stool. You have energy generation, which is solar and wind. You have energy conversion, like inverters and transformers. And then you have energy storage, batteries and fuel cells. And you need to look at all 3 legs of the stools to address them together. And fifth, in terms of the last argument, that was about implementation support is needed. And I think we need to be more digital in delivery of our programs as well. So for example, expanding IRAP to support SMEs. And we're working currently, REMAP is working currently with IRAP, and we published a white paper about the collaboration and onboarding of SMEs and a more of a digital transformation strategy from designing and building their own products to more efficient operations by using their data to inform decisions. But there was already a DTAP program, a digital technology adoption program that was a pilot and that worked well for SMEs. And I think that program can be resurrected and focused for manufacturing SMEs. And lastly, I'd like to make a global comment similar to Robert. I feel like Canada needs to view itself in a very rapidly evolving global marketplace. So our supply chains are linked globally, and that affects our manufacturing capability. We need to be more self-sufficient, whether it's in vaccine production or ventilators or electric vehicle manufacturing. I feel the world is changing and we need to create more vertically integrated supply chains within our own country. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Irene. And David, over to you for your remarks.
Thanks, Janet. I'm going to, broadly agree with much of what David Waters said and endorse a good deal of Robert and Irene's comments as well. I think the critical problem, the 2 critical problems that David nailed clearly on the head. This is a list of initiatives. It is not a strategy. We've had a series of failed strategies from 2002 to the present, and the most critical indicator is the continued decline in both gross expenditures on R&D, but also more importantly, business expenditures on R&D. Both of those have been falling, and there's no response to that to make up for that fall, that decline. David's $22 billion gap is going to have to come from all three of the major spending sectors: the federal government, business, and the higher education sector. There needs to be a strategy in place for how that $22 billion gap is going to be made up. I strongly endorse two of the things that, one thing that David and Robert both emphasized, which is the need for more effective collaboration. Cross-sectoral industry initiatives, I think, can be a hugely valuable way of both generating research and transforming research into innovations, but then diffusing those innovations across a broad range of firms. I don't want to comment on the superclusters at all because we have a whole panel coming up on them in a few minutes. But in some respects, the superclusters are doing a bit of that. The question is, can they, and should they be doing more? But are there other mechanisms like the German initiative that David talked about that we could learn from? I think the other thing that David emphasized that's really important is the need to make more effective use of the economic strategy tables. Some of our researchers have been out talking to a lot of firms over the last couple of years, and one of them, asked them to report back on insights that might be relevant for this discussion. And one thing that came through loud and clear was that a lot of the firms would like to see the economic strategy tables used not just as advisory bodies to the federal government, but as bodies to hold the federal government accountable. So bodies that would be responsible for developing and gathering the data around the kinds of metrics that Irene was talking about or David was talking about, and then using that to measure how much progress we're making towards achieving the strategic goals that we need to set for us, particularly closing the $22 billion gap. And the final thing I want to talk about is scaling up. David talked about the need to go from startup to scale up. The only way we are going to get to the kinds of levels of growth we need is by increasing the number of firms, particularly in technology intensive sectors that are world scale exporters. The domestic market is too small, even if we eliminate all the internal trade barriers. We need to specialize in those industries, sectors, and products that have globally high marginal demands for goods, a high potential for growth for the goods being produced by the firms. And we need to work with the firms that are on the threshold of scaling up to actually make them successful threshold or scale up firms. The Science Council labeled those threshold firms in the 1980s. It's a term I still like to use. And again, some of the research we've done is targeted, the critical obstacles that are standing in the way of these firms getting to global scale. They need better access to markets. That includes both federal and provincial government procurement programs to allow them to get their critical first, major sale on occasion. It needs better education around the strategic use of IP, which has been talked about a lot. It needs better support for selling into global markets. We need support around talent and skills. David talked about the skills strategy, but the skills that are critical to the success of these firms are managerial and scales firms. We need to do a better job of training managers who know how to take a firm to global scale. And that requires a real amount of strategic thinking. And finally are the capital barriers. What the scale-up firms are looking for are non-dilutive capital that will allow the companies to stay in Canadian hands and take them to the next level. I've been looking at this question for 30 years in Canada since I worked for the province in the early 1990s. Everyone I've ever spoken to about this is in agreement. There is no shortage of capital in this country. We are actually a capital-rich country. We have huge pools of savings in our pension plans, in growing number of private equity and venture capital firms. What we're not good at is deploying that capital to support and help Canadian scale-up companies grow to the next level, getting from 50 million to 100 million and getting from 100 million to $1 billion in sales. And we really need to start thinking strategically about how we do that more effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for your very astute comments. We have some good questions in the Q&A, so I think I'll reach to those right away and cover what we can. We have at most 10 more minutes. I'm allowed to push it just a bit. So first, and I think I'll direct this one first to Robert, referencing US current policy, do you think it was a lost opportunity in this federal budget to not have done a Buy Canadian budget or commit to an onshoring and reshoring agenda?
So that's a good question. The interesting thing here, I don't think, is to respond from protectionist policy with protectionist policy. But the idea is this balance between supply side measures and demand side measures. And David mentioned this in his deck. This idea that only tax incentives on the supply side will be enough for firms to innovate, I think seems to me ill-advised. So more demand side measures is effectively creating new markets, new opportunities for our firms to create demand for these products and services. And it is obvious that public procurement can be a key tool for this. So one of the key plank of Biden's infrastructure package is essentially to guarantee to American firms a large part of these contracts. And it seems to me that most countries are doing this very smartly. They have carve-outs. DARPA does this, NASA does this. Why in Canada can't we not allow our public procurement to help our innovation ecosystem? Seems to me the right question. And I'm puzzled that we're still nowhere near a solution. Tom Jenkins spoke about this 10 years or 15 years ago, and we're still asking the same question. I'm puzzled as to why the government is not moving on that.
Thank you.
Janet, I just want to strongly endorse what Robert said. I had this conversation with Canadian technology entrepreneurs 30 years ago. Why couldn't the government, be the critical buyer to help them make their first demonstration sale that would demonstrate the validity of their products in global markets? And we're still struggling with this issue 30 years later.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the same thing, Janet. And a lot of small companies that I deal with are looking for their first customer. And if the government of Canada was their first customer, that would go a long way.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. Oh, just bounced down. Could you address the issue of the economic strategy tables versus the industry strategy council? I think all of you spoke to some version of strengthened collaboration. Does it not seem that the budget was trying to respond to the strategy council? Is the strategy council now the flavor du jour? Are the economic strategy tables even active now? So maybe Irene, I'll turn to you first for this one.
I think I'm the first to admit I do not know why one versus the other. I know the advanced manufacturing economic strategy tables have been developed by a list of, I would say, very well-known private sector individuals that reflect manufacturing and are really, to me, a blueprint of what a budget could become. So I see the budget as where the money is allocated, and then the operations plan is really the kind of the economic strategy tables, and that's what Dave was referring to. And then from that operations plan come the metrics and the actions and the priorities. So I see that we already have that blueprint and that ops plan. I'm not sure why they're not linked together, but I'll leave the other two maybe to comment on the ISC.
Go ahead, David.
No, I have nothing to add to what Irene just said.
So
I honestly do not understand myself why there was a need to create the industry strategy table over and above the economic strategy tables. But I completely endorse what Irene just said about using those blueprints from the economic strategy tables. to as the basis for a national strategy, a national innovation strategy. We need to build from the bottom up. Robert, you said we need a sectoral focus. Again, I've been saying this for a long time. I wholeheartedly agree. We need a little dissent, I think, on this panel.
So it seems that we're too much in agreement on everything. So I'll try to bring a bit of a different perspective on this one. I agree on the need to bring people together to discuss on the diagnostic and what needs to be done. But it seems to me we have done that a long time in Canada. It's now time for action and implementation. And it seems to me that this bureaucratic model, with all due respect of people involved, of having these council strategic stuff for implementation is not the most well-suited one for action. And the reason is I think it is being captured by bureaucratic inertia, with all due respect again for public servants. And my view would be to adopt more of a, again, I bring back this DARPA model where they actually do things. They manage projects. They bring actors together from the private sector, from the public sector, researchers at the heart of it, saying, what are the problems we are trying to solve here? And what's the roadmap to get there? And here's a clock. We have 1 year to solve this problem. If we don't have a good solution in 1 year, this project is over, right? It seems that these tables keeps going and people keep redoing them, and it never achieves anything. So I would just on the implementation side take a slightly different route and have a more intentional public-private partnership.
All right. I unfortunately must now draw this discussion to a conclusion. We are politely past our timeline, but not too far. I want to thank all of you for offering your points of view and all the people who submitted really good questions. There are still some more. So for me, this just demonstrates again what Dave said at the end of his presentation, the need for more dialogue and really sharing and challenging thinking on this. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions and took part in this discussion. There will soon be a flash up requesting the CSPC requesting feedback on this session. So would really appreciate your response on this. And also in just a few minutes, I encourage you to join the third session of the symposium on superclusters. So with that, I'll draw this item to a close. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Janet.
you.
Thanks, Janet.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.